And I think that many of us are here tonight because we believe that even though Pope is an old and trusted organization, that we are nonetheless part of something new, that there is something new being infused in this process and in this moment. And it's not just about a new campaign, but a new and exciting way of thinking about democracy and about political change. And that this idea, which is taking the manifestation of the energy that's going into the COPE campaign here in Vancouver, is in fact a global mood. And it is manifesting itself in different ways locally, as well it should, because of course we are trying to offer an alternative to the homogenization that is represented, that goes under the name globalization, but is really a kind of McGovernment that is stamped around the world. And we are part of a global movement that is celebrating diversity and realizing that diversity is in fact our greatest strength, whether that's cultural diversity, local diversity, agricultural diversity. And I also think that it's part of a moment where many of us are thinking about creating a new intersection between our activism at the local and international levels and our antiquated, discredited, tired, corrupt democratic institutions. And that new idea about how to relate to power, to our quote-unquote democratic institutions, is what I think is going on is that many of us are deciding not to go for the center anymore. Not to put our faith and our hopes and our dreams and our energies into centralized political parties who often betray us. And we are trying another tactic, which is surrounding them from all directions. In our cities, in our towns, at our school boards, at our parks boards. And if this goes on nationally in Canada, which I think there's a real potential for this to spread, and if it goes on internationally, which it already is doing, and I was asked to tie in what's going on here in Vancouver with international movements for participatory democracy, which I will do. If we do all of that, we really are going to be uncontainable. You know, the metaphor that I think has come up most as we have engaged with globalization, with corporate globalization, is the fence. We have found ourselves up against virtual and real fences time and time again, because this is an economic system that fences in our resources through privatizations, and it fences people out. And when people start to rebel, they find themselves up against some pretty real fences. Whether they're around the Summit of the Americas in Quebec City, or the WTO in Seattle, or APEC in Vancouver. We've been at this for a while. So this, I think, is a new strategy. Of course, we have to keep resisting and confronting those fences. But this is the surround them strategy, being uncontainable, being everywhere, because there's no fence big enough to contain that type of grassroots mobilizing that you're all a part of. Now, I think that we're looking for new ways to engage with power because we are at a kind of awkward crossroads where there has been a wave of incredibly inspiring grassroots direct action in Canada and around the world, whether it's outside of summits, whether it is in First Nations communities, in Canada from Sun Peaks to Burnt Church, where there's growing support for seizing back control of the forests and fisheries and not waiting for Ottawa or Victoria to grant permission that the courts have already affirmed. And you also see that same spirit of impatience, I think deserved impatience, in anti-poverty direct action. That there was a rally today, as Larry mentioned, in support of the squatting of the Woodward building here in Vancouver, and they're going to need all of our support. And we had our own version of this in Toronto this summer, and they're still going strong, the Pope Squat. and which was a great branding campaign, actually. The best branded squat, I believe, at the moment. So there is no shortage of militant direct action going on right now. And I think that what ties these actions together is a demand for self-determination, a knowledge that we actually have the ability and the skills to solve our own problems if we are given the resources and the power to do so. This November, it will be 3 years since the anti-WTO protests in Seattle. And I think that we need to ask ourselves with real candor what we have to show for all this mobilizing and all this organizing. Now, one thing that we absolutely have to show is something incredibly precious, which is the networks that have been built. The fact that we know each other better in our own country, in our own cities, and around the world. We've strengthened our coalitions, we've mended bridges. But at the political level, I know that I don't need to tell you that it's ugly out there. And that as we have turned away from electoral politics in disgust, the right has seized this moment with an incredible and insatiable lust for power. Now, this is happening in many parts of the world. It's happening, of course, in British Columbia. It's also happening in France with the rise of the far right and the decline of discredited social democrats. It happened in Italy, which led to the election of Silvio Berlusconi. It's happened in Denmark. And the end result is that we sometimes seem to be fighting like crazy just to make things not quite as bad as they would be otherwise, which is still really bad. So globally, what that means is that we have succeeded in slowing down the speed of further privatizations and deregulation, but they are still absolutely moving forward with this agenda. We have in no way stopped it, let alone begun to reverse it. And locally, I guess we could look to Nelson, where after a huge and inspiring resistance, Nelson won back their maternity care locally, which was an incredible victory, but not their hospital. So it's clear that we have to get a lot more serious, not just about showing resistance and not just about local resistance, but about networking all of these pockets of local resistance and engaging with power. So the question, I think, before us, as some of us tentatively dip our toes in the electoral politics waters, is how do we do this without replicating the mistakes of the past? How do we do it without pouring our energies into electing politicians who break their promises and betray us, or turn back to us, throw up their hands, and say, it cannot be done? No country, no province, no city can stand up to the powers of the international markets. Now, I think for too long we've allowed ourselves to rely on our cynicism, but this can be dangerous, because if the problem is that our politicians are weak, then the answer is that we just need stronger ones. Or if the problem is that our politicians are liars, which of course they are, then the answer is that we need more honest ones. But I think we need to go deeper than those solutions. And we need to start thinking more seriously about what it is in our current system of liberal representative democracy that makes these people so prone to betrayal. Because I think there is something systematic at work. Now, the crisis of faith in traditional electoral politics that led to Gordon Campbell's disastrous election is not a local phenomenon. What is going on here in BC is part of a crisis in representative democracy that is global in nature, and it manifests itself differently. But there are many things in common, like sliding voter turnout, voter participation. But that that betrayal is common. That experience of watching left parties come to power, promising change, only to deliver slight variations on strict neoliberal policies, or in some cases, even stricter and more brutal applications of these policies. And we have seen this everywhere from Bob Rae's Ontario to Tony Blair's Britain to Labour's New Zealand. Now that's the way it looks in rich countries like ours. In poor countries, these betrayals by political parties, these betrayals of real democracy, take different forms, more brutal forms. They're usually tied to debt, actually invariably tied to debt, and to policies of structural adjustment enforced by the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. And you know the refrain, it's, vote for whoever you want. You can even vote for a socialist if you must, so long as they enforce the same policies of privatizations and deregulation, so long as they crack open the country to multinational corporations, so long as they keep paying off the debt, no longer how illegitimate. So there clearly is a problem with the way we have traditionally conceived of political change. It sort of feels like banging your head up against the wall. And we need to get better at learning from our mistakes. Because it seems that there's something about the centralizing of power itself, whether it's a right-wing government or even a centralized socialist one, that makes it too easy for these betrayals to take place, for these backroom deals to take place, that lends itself to believing that further improvements will come with further centralization and further delegation of power to the World Trade Organization, to the International Monetary Fund. So if we're going to challenge the dual crises that we face, which is, on the one hand, the failure of this economic model to bring well-being as promised, but also the failure of our democracies in allowing it to happen, we need new models, new paradigms for political change. And I think fundamentally, we need models for political change that make us harder to control, more difficult to contain, harder to organize and shepherd into these neat little programs, more disobedient. And around the world, I think that there is this spirit of decentralized surround sound activism, creating counterpowers to the centralized state and the centralized solutions of globalization. And I think that the spirit of it is about less representation and more participation, less delegation of power, and more concrete plans to keep power closer to us in our communities. And when that happens, it becomes harder to contain. But I want to prove to you that there is a global spirit out there, which is the spirit of impatience, and on the one hand, of reclaiming, but also of remaking the commons, so that it is truly public. Because I think for too long, the mistake of the left has been to think that to equate state with public, and not realize that we are alienated from many of our state institutions, and they don't feel really public if they aren't democratic, if we don't actually control them. And so, Tony Blair comes along and says, well, we need a third way, and that's public-private partnerships. But the real third way, of course, is having a real public sphere where we actually control it and have participatory democracy. There's a group in Brazil called the MST, the Landless People's Movement. And they are also using direct action to make good on government promises, broken government promises for land reform. They're cutting down fences and occupying unused farmland, the same spirit that's squatting buildings here in Vancouver and in Toronto. And they are building alternatives on that land. They're turning it into co-op farming, to sustainable agriculture, but they're also building schools and community centers. And there's something of this spirit in what's called the social center movement in Italy, where a lot of the young people who grew up with a sold-out social democratic government in power turned away from the state, turned away from electoral politics, and started taking over abandoned buildings and building social centers, which are really community centers, art centers, and also political centers. And these were always seen as sort of anarchist strongholds. But one of the things that has started to happen in the past 3 years in Italy is that some of the key people from the social center movement, and there are about 150 social centers across Italy, have started to run for municipal office. And they've started to win. They've taken over Venice, believe it or not. Picturesque Venice is run by anarchists. and they're thinking about how to use the city as a site of resistance on innovative, affordable housing, but also on rights of refugees, and getting into areas that previously had been, we've always been told, though, that's not a municipal issue. You're only supposed to deal with the garbage, figuratively and literally. and probably the place in the world where this idea is most, maybe most advanced, is in Brazil, where the PT, the Workers' Party, has come to power in 200 municipalities and started introducing participatory budgets. And I know many of you know about the participatory budget process, but the general idea is that instead of delegating, electing a politician and saying, okay, you've got a blank check for 4 years, get back to me afterwards, saying to our politicians that their role is to create opportunities and institutions for us to have direct input. And the participatory budget allows for direct input on every line item in the budget. And the challenge now, and this is why I think all eyes really should be on Argentina in the coming months, is that they have a federal election coming up at the end of March. And the question is, how do you take this spirit of spontaneous participation and direct action and turn it into real politics, big P politics, government? How do we embed it in our democratic institutions? Is it possible? And I think the jury is still out on that. I don't know if it is possible, but the reason why I think it's worth watching is because they are trying. And they are developing the policy of what it would look like, from participatory budgets to constituent assemblies to very, very, very short mandates for politicians with recalls and referenda. And a lot of the ideas that here in Canada we have ceded to the right. And we have told ourselves, I think on the left, that participatory democracy somehow is inherently reactionary. And I think we need to ask ourselves, if we were to learn from Argentina, if we were to learn from Brazil, if we were to learn from the countries that are further along than we are in rebuilding democracy, what would it look like? Well, and I have to say this with genuine and real respect for Jack Layton and Libby Davies, who are here tonight, who've spent their lives fighting for local democracy. I have to say that it wouldn't look much like the federal or provincial NDP. And I have to say that I don't think it would even look like a kind of new improved NDP. And I think the reason for that is that if we really listen to the most economically and socially excluded Canadians, what we hear is something very similar to Que se vayan todos, okay? You hear an incredible anger and distrust of the state, and not just of particular politicians, but of the institutions of government. Now, that distrust does not mean that you are a right-wing reactionary. It means you have been paying attention. It comes in our most vulnerable communities in this country from experience. It comes from experiences with police harassment and violence against homeless people, against immigrants, against drug users, against activists. It comes with direct experience with punitive welfare officers. It comes with direct experience with ineffective and corrupt job retraining programs in rural areas. It comes by watching our natural resources being scandalously mismanaged by the government in Victoria or in Ottawa. Now, I think that the mainstream left in this country has failed to come to grips with the way most Canadians see government, and has instead fetishized state solutions and often failed state bureaucracies. So if this is going to change, we need politicians, and I believe that COPE is going to be part of this process, and is already part of this process, that is not afraid of these challenges and is not afraid to listen to the voices in First Nations communities and in non-Native resource communities, where the common ground, despite all the attempts to divide, is rage at government, federal and provincial, for culpably mismanaging the land and oceans. And we also need politicians who can see that what's happening in our cities, with forced amalgamations and bundling into mega cities and mega school boards and mega hospital boards, is actually about more than spending cuts. What we are seeing at the city level is a kind of globalization in miniature, because it's the same logic of centralization and standardization, the same McGovernment model that we see play out in smaller scales. And if you want to know what I mean, talk to a teacher who is having standardized testing rammed down her throat by a half-literate politician. I mean, this is, or talk to a doctor or a nurse or a midwife who's working in a hospital managed by a corporate executive. The common refrain, if we are willing to listen, if we're not afraid of hearing it, coming from our schools, our hospitals, our resource communities and First Nation communities from Quebec, is not a demand for better central planning. It is rage at centralization, at a loss of control, and it's hunger for local power and deep democracy. Now, in this context, in the context of this rage, it's easy to sell privatizations, even if there isn't the support. There isn't enough love for the public sector to stop it. So our task is not just to defend the status quo, it is to reclaim and rebuild the public sphere so that there is something there for us to love so that we can defend it. Now, by failing to speak to this rage, we on the left have handed over this terrain to the right, to often the racists, and it's not going to be solved, from what I can tell, from reading NDP policy, where it seems that there's no problem that can't be fixed with a stronger top-down government. And I think fundamentally, it's that there's a fear in this country of people, of democracy. We tend to dismiss it as cheap populism, and that's how we've lost this terrain. But there clearly is space on the political spectrum for a different vision, a vision founded on local democracy in respect for communities and the expertise and knowledge that exists there, and in sustainable economic development. Because I don't think that what we need is another savior or a better master plan. What we need are the tools, both financial and democratic, to control our destinies and to use the expertise and knowledge that is in our communities. And there's, the ideas are out there. They're out there in BC, from community fish license banks to community forests to affordable housing. And, let's be clear, these ideas, particularly around community self-management around natural resources, are a direct challenge to the way neoliberal economics works. Because what people are saying is that they want to tie, for instance, resource extraction to the creation of local jobs, to secondary industries, to balancing it with other values, including preservation. Now, the model that we're getting from Ottawa and from Victoria is that we need to pander to foreign investors. We can't make any demands. Any demands that we make on foreign investors are a barrier to trade. So spontaneously, what is coming out of communities is a challenge to this logic. So I think that they're clearly, even though I admit, I think it is true that this rage at government can turn into right-wing populism. It can be used to peddle anti-immigrant sentiment. It can be used to exacerbate regional resentments. But I think there is, alongside this, a deep desire in this country to continue to act collectively. And we see this, to pool resources and knowledge to build something that we can't achieve as individuals. And what's exciting to me about this in the context, the broader political context that we're in, surrounded by economic and religious fundamentalists poised for war, is that this idea of local democracy is fundamentally anti-fundamentalist. Because it doesn't seek to impose a system from on high, but actually tries to find the mechanisms for many diverse and subtle systems to emerge from below. This is our real third way. Reclaiming the commons so that we actually feel that we own them. And this situation presents a tremendous opportunity for the left in Canada. And I believe that, and I feel in this room that COPE is ready to seize it and is already seizing it. There is a wide open space for political coalitions, because I think we need this to happen nationally. We need COPE to be part of a national movement that is inspired by this process, that sees all these calls for self-determination and local power, and doesn't see a dire threat to national unity, but the building blocks for a better and more diverse and more unified country. Now, decentralizing power doesn't mean abandoning strong national and international standards. It doesn't mean abandoning stable and equitable funding. If you're going to have real self-determination, you need rules to make that self-determination possible. But I think it does mean that the mantra of the left needs to change from stop the cuts to empower the grassroots. And I think that's starting to happen. I think that our task is to take the spirit of direct action that we have seen in glimpses outside the summits, reclaiming a building and turning it into affordable housing. If we take those glimpses and we find a way to embed that spirit of participation, of local control, into the way we do politics every day, and we root it in our communities on an ongoing basis. And I think if we do that, it is going to spread. And this can happen in one city, it can happen in our towns, it can happen in our school boards, at the Parks Board. These can be sites of resistance, of deep political participation and decision-making on the one hand. But on the other hand, they can also be sites of radical non-participation. Radical non-participation in the implementation of the brutal economic policies that are ravaging our communities and strip mining our resources. This is another way of thinking about local politics. So on the one hand, we build our mechanisms for political participation in the public sphere, but we use the legitimacy that comes from that participation, because when people participate in institutions, it legitimizes it. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. It becomes harder to take on. To refuse when Gordon Campbell tells the school board that they have to cut another teacher. And this is what's starting to happen in Ontario. And I think that this can happen. Because maybe the hard lesson, because what we've seen is we've seen provincial politicians now co-opting the language of local democracy and giving a kind of a paper power. You can make decisions, but we're not going to give you the resources to do anything but do our dirty work. So when I say that if you do take over the city council, if you do take over the school board and the parks board, these can be sites of resistance. It means it can be refusing to implement those policies. And because it is possible that we can't beat these guys on their own terms, that we don't have the money at this point, that they have that territory. But the real question is, and I think the jury's still out, is whether or not they can beat us on our own turf. Thank you.